Right now, on every road in America, roughly 200 million cars are equipped with a mechanism that pulses, pauses, and pulses again, mimicking, almost exactly, the involuntary blink of a human eye. Most drivers have touched that stalk 1,000 times without a single thought about who made it possible. His name was Robert Keynes, and the industry that built its luxury on his idea made sure you'd never hear it. In the winter of 1953, on his wedding night in Detroit, a champagne cork struck Robert Keynes directly in his left eye. The injury was severe enough to partially blind him in that eye permanently. Most people would call that a tragedy and move on. Keynes spent the next decade turning it into a question. If his damaged eye could still open, pause, and close in a controlled rhythm, if his eyelid could regulate itself even when partially injured, why couldn't a windshield wiper do the same thing? That question would consume him. It would eventually consume everything else too. Robert Keynes was born in 1927 in Gary, Indiana, and grew up the kind of person who couldn't pass a mechanical problem without stopping to solve it. He studied electrical engineering at the University of Detroit, later earned a PhD, and built a respectable academic career as a professor. He was not a garage tinkerer in the romantic, disheveled sense of the myth. He was methodical, credentialed, and precise. He kept notebooks. He documented everything. That habit of documentation would matter enormously later, both as his greatest weapon and, in a way, his longest torment. He had 6 children. He coached Little League. By every measure, Robert Keynes in the early 1960s was living an ordinary, decent American life. But inside that life, the question about his eye never left him. Every time it rained, he watched his car's wiper blades sweep in a frantic, unvarying arc across the glass, and it nagged at him. The existing wiper system ran at one speed or two, constant, mechanical, indiscriminate, running the same regardless of whether it was a drizzle or a downpour. His eye didn't work that way. Nothing biological worked that way. So why did every car in the world accept this as the only option? In 1963, in his basement in suburban Detroit, Robert Keynes solved the problem. He built a working prototype of an intermittent windshield wiper using off-the-shelf electronic components, a transistor, a capacitor, a resistor, a few other standard parts, wired together into a circuit that could sense a delay, hold it, and then trigger the wiper at whatever interval the driver chose. Rain getting lighter, turn the dial, mist on a cool morning. A slow, measured sweep every few seconds. The car's wiper could now, for the first time, match the rhythm of actual weather rather than running uselessly against it. He installed the prototype on a 1962 Ford Galaxie and drove it through a rainstorm. It worked. His wife Mary saw it and immediately understood what he had done. He filed a patent application in 1963, and the U.S. Patent Office granted him a series of patents between 1964 and 1974, covering the core mechanism and its variations. Here's what made the invention genuinely revolutionary, not just incrementally useful. Before Keynes, the only way to slow a wiper motor was to run it at mechanical friction, grinding it down, essentially, which wore out the motor fast and never gave drivers real control. Keynes's circuit introduced electronic timing. The motor ran at full speed for each sweep, then the circuit interrupted the signal, held it in a precise pause, and released it again. The wiper wasn't running slow, it was stopping and starting with intelligence. That distinction is what made it reliable, durable, and endlessly adjustable. It was, at its core, an electronic brain grafted onto a mechanical arm. The automotive industry in 1964 was not yet thinking this way. Electronics in cars were rudimentary. Keynes had built something that crossed a conceptual line the major manufacturers hadn't crossed yet, and he knew it. He went to Ford. In 1966, he demonstrated his system to Ford engineers in Dearborn, Michigan. He showed them his circuit, explained the mechanism, let them examine it. Ford's engineers were, by all contemporary accounts, impressed. Keynes left that meeting believing a licensing deal was imminent. He had every reason to think so. He had patents pending, a working prototype, and the undivided attention of the world's second-largest automaker. Ford went quiet. For months, Keynes heard nothing concrete. Then, in 1969, Ford introduced the intermittent windshield wiper as a feature on its new models, not as a licensed product from Robert Keynes. As a Ford feature, engineered by Ford, owned by Ford. The circuit inside those cars used a capacitor and a variable resistor to time the pause between sweeps. It was, in its essential function, the same principle Keynes had patented 5 years earlier and demonstrated to their engineers 3 years before. Keynes wrote letters, he hired lawyers, he watched the feature spread not just to Ford but to Chrysler, General Motors, Mercedes-Benz, Toyota, until by the mid-1970s it was standard on virtually every new car sold in America, tens of millions of vehicles. The intermittent wiper Keynes had built in his basement was now one of the most widely used automotive features in the world, and he had received nothing, not a royalty, not a credit. Not even a response to his letters that acknowledged what he believed they had taken. What happened next is where Robert Keynes's story becomes something harder to look at directly. He filed suit against Ford in 1978. He eventually added Chrysler. The cases were staggering in their scope. He was a private individual, a university professor with limited personal resources, suing two of the most powerful corporations in American industrial history. Ford immediately moved to have the patents invalidated, arguing that Keynes's circuit was assembled from existing components and therefore not a novel invention. This is a common defense in patent litigation, and on the surface it has a certain logic. But patent law doesn't require that every component be new. It requires that the combination, the application, the system be original. Keynes's lawyers knew this. The problem was that keeping qualified lawyers proved almost impossible. Over the course of 2 decades, Keynes went through lawyers repeatedly. Firms would take the case, spend months on it, then either settle without his authorization or withdraw. Keynes, who believed passionately that what had been done to him was a moral wrong as much as a legal one, rejected several settlement offers from Ford because they refused to include an admission of wrongdoing. He wanted them to say they had stolen from him. They refused. He walked away from deals worth millions because of that refusal. The emotional cost became catastrophic. By the early 1980s, his marriage to Mary had deteriorated to the breaking point. She had stood by him through the initial years of the legal fight, but the obsession, the way the case had taken over every room of his life, every hour, every dollar of energy, made normal family life impossible. They divorced. Keynes suffered a mental breakdown severe enough to require hospitalization. He was found wandering in Washington, D.C., confused and in crisis. He spent time at St. Elizabeth's Hospital. He recovered, and when he recovered, he went back to the case. At various points, Keynes began representing himself in court. A man with a PhD in engineering, no formal legal training, and a case against some of the most expensive corporate legal teams in the country, writing his own briefs, filing his own motions, arguing before federal judges. The sheer audacity of it was either inspiring or terrifying depending on where you stood. For Keynes, it was simply the only path forward. He believed the facts were on his side. He believed the patents were valid, and he was right. In 1990, a federal jury found that Ford had infringed on Keynes's patents. The award was $10.1 million, which sounds significant until you consider that Ford was at the time selling hundreds of thousands of cars per year with the feature installed, and that Keynes had spent over a decade and most of his adult life fighting for it. Ford appealed. Keynes appealed the amount, arguing it was too low. The appeals dragged on. Ford ultimately paid. 3 years later, in 1992, a separate jury found that Chrysler had also infringed. The Chrysler case awarded Keynes $30 million. He had sued some 24 other automakers as well, cases that would continue to wind through the courts for years. He won, by the strict legal definition. Robert Keynes won. His children described a father they had watched disappear into this fight. His son Dennis, who had studied law partly to help his father, worked alongside him for years. His daughter Cassie, in interviews, spoke about watching a man whose fundamental decency and need for justice had been turned into a weapon that slowly dismembered the life he'd been trying to protect. The money was real. The vindication was real. And somehow, neither of those things gave back what had been spent to get there. Robert Keynes died on February 9, 2005, in Dearborn, Michigan. He was 77 years old. He had been living with Alzheimer's disease in his final years. He died a few miles from the Ford headquarters, where nearly 4 decades earlier, engineers had listened to his idea, and then, by any reasonable reading of what followed, used it anyway. Ford and Chrysler never admitted wrongdoing. Their legal positions, consistently maintained, was that their engineers developed the technology independently. That position was rejected by 2 separate juries, but a legal verdict is not the same as an acknowledgement. Keynes understood the difference. It was, in some ways, the engine of everything. He needed them to say it, and they never would. What does this story actually tell us? Because it's easy to reduce it to a simple villain narrative. Faceless corporation crushes individual, and that reduction, while emotionally satisfying, misses the sharper point. The American patent system exists explicitly to protect inventors like Robert Keynes. It grants a temporary monopoly in exchange for public disclosure of the invention. The theory is elegant. Inventors share their knowledge, and society rewards them with the right to commercialize it. Keynes did exactly what the system asked. He documented his invention, filed his patents, disclosed his mechanism, and then approached an established industry player to license it properly. What he encountered instead was an industry so large, so accustomed to its own dominance, that the idea of paying a professor from suburban Detroit for something its engineers could replicate seemed, practically speaking, optional. Not because anyone sat in a room and decided to steal from him, necessarily. The reality is more corrosive than that. The decision was made in the space between taking a meeting and never quite following up, between examining a prototype and having internal engineers produce something functionally identical, between knowing a man had a patent and calculating whether it was cheaper to fight him in court for a decade than to pay him fairly at the start. That calculation, made by the legal and financial minds of multiple Fortune 500 companies against one man with a basement workshop and a patent filing, is the real subject of this story. It's not about malice in the theatrical sense. It's about what happens when the machinery of commerce determines that an individual's rights are a cost-benefit problem rather than a moral fact. Keynes won in court, and the companies that infringed his patents continued operating at full strength, absorbed the settlements as litigation expenses, and never had their fundamental way of doing business disrupted. In the same period, Keynes was fighting, spending his savings, losing his marriage, and suffering a breakdown. Those companies were posting profits, expanding operations, and eventually continuing to introduce new features and new models without those experiences leaving any visible scar. He won, and the system that was supposed to protect him so thoroughly failed him in practice that his victory arrived only after it had cost him nearly everything the victory was meant to preserve. In 2008, 3 years after Keynes died, a film called Flash of Genius was released, with Greg Kinnear playing Robert Keynes. It brought a brief wave of public attention to the story, and then, as these things tend to go, the wave passed. The intermittent wiper is still on every car. The stalk is still there on your steering column. The mechanism still pulses in rain, pauses in mist, blinks, exactly as Keynes described, like a human eye. He built something that works so naturally, so seamlessly, that it has become invisible. You don't think about it until it isn't there. That invisibility is the strange, painful final irony of his story. The perfection of his invention is part of what allowed the world to forget who made it. The next time rain hits your windshield and you reach for that stalk without thinking, that reflex, that automatic gesture, know that it was not always there. Somebody spent their basement, their marriage, their decades, and finally their mind making sure it would be. His name was Robert Keynes, and he deserved better than what the world gave him in return.